Okay, hi everyone. My name is Elina, and I'm the head of activities of Students for Sustainability. And welcome to the first S4S lecture. Great to see that you are all here today. For this lecture, we are very happy to have Donald Pols as our speaker, and he is the director of Milieudefensie. And he's going to tell us everything about the case Milieudefensie started against Shell in December 2020. But as I've told you, this is a lecture organized by Students for Sustainability. And we are an organization which informs and inspires students to use their technical skills for a more sustainable world. And in case this sounds like something you might be interested in, or if you're looking for a new adventure next year, we're currently actually recruiting a new board. So definitely make sure to check out our website or Instagram, or just send us a message in case you're interested. All right. Donald will first go ahead and tell you his story, and then there will be some time for questions and also debate. So everybody have fun, and I hope you're really going to enjoy this lecture. So Donald, the floor is yours. Take it away.
Thank you. And thank you everybody for participating. It's always a privilege for me to talk to students, because you will be creating the future, and especially technology students, because, and it's a joke, me and my nephew, he's the nephew with whom I grew up. I grew up in South Africa, and he was my neighbor. And we always joke that I create the market through NGO actions and ensuring that there's more ambitious climate policy. I create the market that he can then, he's working for Shell, he can then capitalize on. And maybe that is what I will be doing, and my organization is doing for you also. So listen carefully and see how you can capitalize on the market that we are creating for you through this climate litigation. I'm now going to share my screen with you. Yeah, this should be it. Okay. I assume you're seeing my my PowerPoint presentation now, Eileen, is that correct? Yeah, okay. This is a presentation about a climate court case that's started formally 2 years ago, and you see me and our lawyer Roger Cox when we announced the court case some 2 years ago. The formal procedure is that you first write a letter to the institution or organization or person that you're going to take to court, request that person or organization, in this case Shell, change its ways. Mostly they don't, and of course then you can formally start the court procedure. And here, this is where we announced the letter that we wrote to Shell. What makes our court case unique is the fact that we are demanding, requesting future change in the behavior of Shell and not financial damages. As you can see here on the left-hand side is an overview published in the scientific magazine Nature of all current climate litigation. In total, globally, there are more than 1,300 court cases with climate changes as its subject. And of these, the first case that is aimed at changing the behavior of a party is the case by Milieudefensie. The others were all demanding damages. For example, cities asking big polluters to contribute to the cost of climate mitigation or climate adaptation. For example, in New York, the government of New York requested of Exxon that they contribute to changes in the spatial planning of New York. But we are asking that Shell aligns its strategy and its investments to the international climate agreement that were made in Paris in 2015, and that means that they should reduce their CO2 by 45% in 10 years' time in 2030. That is a conservative estimate of what is necessary for a global operating oil company to ensure that dangerous climate change does not take place, and that we as a global society transform our economy in accordance to the International Climate Agreement. So that is, but I'm not going to talk too much about the content of our court case. I personally think that is less interesting. And afterwards, after my presentation, you can ask me questions on the content if you are interested in the content of the court case. I'm going to give you an overview of why we went to court to take on Shell. As I know, it's rather difficult to keep your attention on a presentation in Zoom. Normally, I try to be a bit more inspiring, but as it's you can read, it can be best tedious to listen to a PowerPoint presentation on Zoom. I give you a bit of a description so that you know what can be expected of this presentation. First, I'm going to argue that it's necessary to consider novel strategies to ensure a reduction of greenhouse gases. Then I'm going to point to the fact that climate change is in itself not necessarily, not in the first instance, a CO2 problem, but a responsibility crisis. Then I'm going to argue that it's necessary to regulate multinational corporations in order to achieve climate mitigation. I'm going to give you a bit of a description of what the expected broader impact of our climate court case is going to be if we win. And I'm going to finish by describing the relation to law and the use of law as an instrument to achieve climate mitigation. To start off with why new strategies are necessary. You know, in 1992, that is almost 30 years ago, the first climate agreement was signed by the global community. It's called the United Nations Framework on Climate Change, Framework Convention on Climate Change. And since then, and that's what you can see on the left-hand side, since then, CO2 emissions just kept on increasing globally. So after 30 years, 3 decades of negotiations and talking about CO2 reductions, we have not managed to reduce CO2 emissions as a global society. But also as the Netherlands, on the right-hand side, you see the CO2 emissions in the Netherlands. The gray area is the CO2 emissions. And you see that even in the Netherlands, since the last 10 years, CO2 emissions has also not really been reduced. So it's clearly that whatever the broader environmental movement and whatever governments have been doing to address climate change, it has not been working. So it is at least, we as a society should at least consider other ways to achieve a climate safe future. And as far as Milieudefensie is concerned, it's not a discussion about good versus bad, the people on the left-hand side versus the bad corporations on the right-hand side. And the reason for this is very clear, that our industrial society is based on fossil fuels. More so, the industrial society was launched on the back of fossil fuels, more or less 150 years ago, with the use of coal. Everything we have is based on fossil fuels. Our economy, our energy is intrinsically linked to fossil fuels. So to think in terms of a division in two groups of those good and bad creates a funnel as a society from which we will not reach a solution. So it's not about Shell being bad that we took Shell to court. The real problem is a crisis of responsibility. And I'm using the example on the left-hand side of Spider-Man. I think for those of us old enough to remember Spider-Man, what we see is that every actor in society tries to shift the blame to another actor. And I think a Dutch politician, Pieter Omtzigt, described this very nicely by saying that in the Netherlands, the biggest success of any civil servant or politician is when he can prove that he is not responsible for totally responsible for a problem. And that is from a low-level civil servant to the highest level of any politician you can think, and use it and reflect on it on your own experience in politics. Isn't this what you see everywhere? Politicians really shining. You can see the pride in themselves when they could prove in a way that they are not totally responsible, but that somebody else is responsible. And in practice, you see it also in the climate change issue. Shell says, in essence, and that's also what they said in the court, but companies in general do that. They say, we are not responsible. We are providing to service the demand. The demand is then other businesses and consumers. And the consumer says, yeah, what can I do? My consumption is such a small contribution to climate change. I cannot be held responsible. And in any case, I'm constrained by my available finance. It's the citizen that should decide, because the citizen votes for politicians, and the citizen then says, yeah, I voted for the politicians. They should take responsibility. And politicians say, the government, that is all of us. So all of us should take responsibility. And that is what this Spider-Man picture illustrates. And this crisis of responsibility, of nobody taking responsibility for the public good, is unfortunately much deeper than only the climate crisis. It is a crisis of our political system, a crisis that originated in, philosophically, if you want, in the 19th century, best described by Adam Smith, the godfather of the economic theory, that said the invisible hand directs the economy. There is no collective decision-making. There is no collective interest. It is everybody acting in its own interest, and that leads to a collective result. And politically, this was the best illustrated by one of the two most famous neoliberal politicians, Margaret Thatcher, the other being Ronald Reagan. And Mrs. Thatcher said, there is no thing as society. There are only individual men and women, and there are families. So when you say there is no such thing as society, that means there is no such thing as a collective interest. And therefore also no need to manage the collective interest, and no need to take responsibility for the collective interest. So this is what Milieudefensie, Friends of the Netherlands, is trying to break through this responsibility crisis, because in our view, only if we manage to break through the responsibility crisis can we manage our collective global good, our global interest as a society. And we start by saying that to determine responsibility, there are at least three criteria that are of importance. the contribution that an individual or a group made to the damage to society or ecology. In this instance, the contribution to CO2 emissions. The second being the knowledge that you had or have about the damage. So how long did you know that CO2 emissions, that your CO2 emissions will contribute to climate change? And the third, the possibility to address climate change. And this, of course, if you look at this, the shop owner, the corner shop owner, has a different responsibility than the CEO of a big multinational. And that's why we are saying, and we also said this in court, that Shell has a responsibility. So when Shell says that not we as Shell, but the demand for our products are the main reason for climate change, we are saying that is true. The demand is important, but also you as Shell has a responsibility based on the three criteria that I just mentioned. Shell invests more than 95% of its annual investments in contributing to climate change. So it has a major contribution to CO2 emissions, while it only invests less than 1 or 2 billion per year in renewable energy in the solution, while it has the resources to do much, much more to invest in developing alternatives to fossil fuel. Then the third issue that I want to discuss with you is the need to regulate multinationals. At this stage, what I try to illustrate on the left-hand side is that you see the global economy has globalized, while on the right-hand side, the legal frameworks regulating economy and society is still national in most cases, and in some cases has gone up to regional scale. We have companies, and multinational companies are the most illustrative example of the global economy. We have multinational companies that have a turnover that are comparable to countries. For example, Walmart, the American supermarket chain, has an economy that is comparable in size to the Belgian economy. All of Shell, for example, its emissions, only one company's emissions are comparable to the half of the poorest part of the world's countries together, only one company. And multinationals are not regulated. So because of the fact that we have national legal frameworks and we have an international globalized economy with globalized multinational companies, we have an important actor that is not part of the regulated economy. And it's not just, it is very important that these companies are not part of a legal framework. You know, I began my presentation by referring to the fact that as a global society, more than 198 countries got together in 2015 to sign the Paris Climate Accord, the international agreement to regulate greenhouse gases. But these companies were not present, multinational companies were not present and fall outside of the remit of this agreement. So, and 20 companies, only 20 companies emit 1/3 of global CO2 emissions. 25 companies emit 50% of all global greenhouse gas emissions, and they are not regulated. So our statement as Milieudefensie is, it is impossible to achieve a climate safe emissions of greenhouse gas emissions. If these multinationals are not regulated, there's no single scenario possible by the most creative scenario writer in which we achieve climate safety without these companies being regulated. And if you assume that you need to regulate multinational companies, such as Shell, you have three options. You can work towards a multilateral legal framework and a multilateral sanctioning body, which you like something like the World Trade Organization or the UN or something similar. But the examples that we have illustrate that this is highly unlikely that we will manage to institute a multilateral regulating institution in the time needed to manage climate change. Then the second option is self-regulation. You can assume that companies will regulate themselves and ensure that their emissions stay within the climate safe norms of the Paris Climate Accord. But that is, of course, it's almost impossible for companies to do that, because you have the problem of free riders that will always try to profit from the fact that others make costs to reduce their CO2 emissions, and they can then, those free riders can continue to sell their products under undercut the cost of those that do self-regulation. So that's not going to happen, especially in with the growth of the new participants in the economy, Brazil, India, China, and other countries. And then your third option is to ensure that multinational companies such as Shell are brought under national regulation. And that is what we're doing in our climate court case against Shell. We are asking the Dutch court to ensure that Shell should be part of the Dutch regulation. And what do we think we're going to achieve by our court case? And what we, let me say it like, I'd rather that you assume that that the Financial Times probably has a better perspective on what the impact of our court case can be, because I'm of course an interested party in this. So the Financial Times on the 4th of February wrote that there are 3 probable impacts because of our climate court case. The first is that if we win, of course, companies will change their behavior in order to preempt court cases. So other companies, the moment that we win in the Netherlands, the moment that the Dutch court orders Shell to reduce its CO2 emissions in accordance to the Paris Climate Accord, other companies will know that this is a risk that it could happen to them also. So they would then start to introduce climate mitigating policies on their own accord. The second impact will be that colleague NGOs in other countries will start similar cases to what we are doing in the Netherlands. And to be honest, that is not only in theory. We are actively supporting NGOs in other countries to start their own climate litigation against major polluters. For example, our colleagues in France, an NGO called Friends of the Earth, but then in French, Amigo, no, whatever. They started a similar case against Total. And the third option, the third ripple effect, third impact of our court case, if we win, will be that governments introduce more ambitious climate policy in order to create a level playing field. So, for example, if in Europe or in the Netherlands, if we win the court case against Shell, of course, Shell will be at a disadvantage in comparison to its competitors. But for example, Exxon in the US, or Gazprom in Russia. So the European regulator, in order to protect Shell, in order to ensure a level playing field, will introduce policy that at least ensures that foreign competitors of Shell have to implement the same type of CO2 mitigating measures. For example, what is now discussed is a border tax correction, so that whenever a company from outside of Europe wants to import into Europe, they have to pay a CO2 tax comparable to what the tax or the cost that European producers have. And then the law as a crowbar. We are using the law as an instrument to ensure ambitious climate policy. I gave you the example of Shell. Shell emits 2 times as much CO2 emissions as the Dutch economy altogether. So if we manage to get Shell to act in accordance to ambitious climate policy, the impact will be enormous. And we're using the law and the court as a way to achieve that. And you could ask yourself the question, is this an appropriate methodology? And again, I'd rather quote a legal expert. I'm quoting Professor Jaap Spier, who is Professor of Law and Global Challenges at the University of Amsterdam. He's specialized in liability law. And up until 2016, 5 years ago, he was the Attorney General at the Dutch Supreme Court. There are not many people that are more knowledgeable about the intricacies of the Dutch court system, law system, than Professor Jaap Spier. And he says a judge does a responsible job if he's willing to look for solutions to a problem that would otherwise, and the problem is of course climate change, that would otherwise cause us untold misery. You can say, if the government fails, if politics fails, which is of course true, then the world must go down. If you find that, then the judge has no business. I do not think that that is an attractive, nor is it the correct view. And you can imagine that I agree with Professor Spier. And then the last slide in my presentation, and this is more aimed at the Dutch speakers, unfortunately, because this can only be understood in Dutch. In essence, what all of us, the question that we are all confronted with is singular. It is, how will we pass on our Earth to the next generation? And maybe for you that is less of an issue. The older you get, the more this becomes an issue. I have 3 kids, and my work at Milieudefensie is motivated by this basic question. How will I pass on our Earth to my kids? And I think it was the best formulated by Vrouwtje Veenstra. That's a Dutch singer-songwriter that produced an unsuspected hit a year ago. And she says, I want a future. I want a kid. I want a career. I want a garden. I want a family. I want to taste the real taste of pure air. And I believe fundamentally that I wish for my kids all these very, what in Dutch you would say, burgerlijk stuff. I really wish that they have a future in which they can realize their dreams, and that all of us should do everything within our means to ensure the safe future for our kids. Thank you very much.
So if anyone has a question, then just unmute yourself and ask the question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I have a question. First, I wanted to thank you for your very clear presentation. I had no problems at all keeping my attention during your lecture. I do have a question, though it is divided into two parts. You mentioned that if you would regulate all of those multinational companies at the same time, it would be fair and you could diminish like a really large part of the emissions in the world. But what about the smaller companies who aren't multinationals? Don't you think that they would fill the void that those multinationals can no longer fill because of the regulations? And if you would fight that and you would say, let's make all companies that have emissions, adhere to these regulations, will that still be like a free market if the government is suddenly involved in every step of a company?
To start off with the first, oil exploration and development is a highly technical sector, and for example, doing exploration on high seas and in the North Pole, it's almost impossible for smaller companies. So, and even when they could develop oil, if the space is created by the lack of the presence of shell, like I used the examples, they will be regulated away by the European regulator to ensure to protect the Dutch or European companies. So that's the first. And the second is about the free market economy. Of course, there is the free market is an ideal. There is nothing like a true free market. We require companies to produce within specific health norms. We require them to pay a specific minimum wage. There's an enormous amount of regulation already in existence. So the question is what you do with that regulation, and that's why I'm not for a planned economy, which you refer to, like in a communist country. Yeah. So I'm much more in favor for either a tax or emission trading, where you give pollution a price, and in that way companies can themselves decide how they organize their value chain in order to reduce CO2.
Okay, thank you. That very much answers my question. I do have a quick follow-up, if I'm allowed, by the other people waiting to ask their questions. Do you think that there should be like a world panel that could implement these regulations quickly, so that all companies at once can do this instead of having politics that conflict between continents?
Yes, that would be the best way forward. But the interests of countries are so dissimilar. You can only imagine the difference in the interest of an oil producing country like Saudi Arabia with a poor country like Mali, or that it's not to be expected. It's not realistic that a global regulating institution will be achieved within a few years' time.
Okay, thank you.
Couldn't this be like, I'm hearing an echo. Couldn't this be like possible with the international waters? We already see that we're like setting carbon we ask something from our carbon emissions in an international way. Isn't there like from the
Yeah, I understand your question. And maybe the best illustration is to describe how the climate negotiations went. Up until the climate meeting that took place, I think it was in 2008 or 2010, I'm not sure, that took place in Copenhagen in Denmark. The whole approach of the international climate negotiations was towards a global agreement that it would be binding and force all countries to reduce their CO2 emissions according to a given calculation. But it didn't work. They just did not manage to get countries to agree on a binding CO2 framework. And that's why they decided to, as a global community, decided to approach it in a different manner. And therefore, in 2015, 5 years later, we agreed a global agreement that has a different approach. It's called a promise and a peer-reviewed system. So instead of having an absolute CO2 target, you promise, pledge and review, sorry, I forgot that. It's a pledge and review. So instead of having a global target that is binding for all countries, every country pledges freely what their CO2 emissions reductions will be, and they review it annually on how is the reductions going. So it's a different approach. The first one was close to what you just proposed, one target binding for all countries. That didn't work, and now we have a system of pledge and review. You promise, and you illustrate how your promise is going in regular meetings.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, I also do have a question if time allows. First of all, again, thank you very much for your speech. I really admire what you're doing. But when I look at the case critically and what, well, especially the EU is doing, what is your stance on that a case like this triggers populism, as we're already seeing that investors are divesting in carbon, and that we're seeing the EU taxonomy in place, and that we have a carbon tax in the EU that will only rise in the coming, well, 30 years until we're in 2050. So I just wonder, with all these things in place, what's the added value, and what's your stance on like the effect it has on populism and those kinds of subjects?
Yeah, that is an enormously important issue. We tend to, especially climate policymakers, tend to think of their subject in a very isolated manner, and often do not ask this question. And that is why, and it's true. Currently, I haven't looked at the last price of CO2 in the emissions trading system, but I think it's probably something like 25 or 30 euros per ton of CO2. But it needs to, and it needs to be at least 50 euro per ton of CO2. And that illustrates that the cost will increase enormously. Our demand is that the income of the emissions trading system or of a tax should be invested in mitigating measures to ensure that lower income and people are protected against the rise in cost. We call it a just and fair transition, and it's very necessary. Already, to give you an example, already poor people pay 3 to 4 times more energy tax as a share of their income compared to rich people. And of the taxes, the funds that are raised through the energy tax, 80% of the income goes to companies as subsidies, So what you see is a sort of a Robin Hood tax, but then the other way around. You take from the poor and you give to the rich. And of the 20% of taxes that did not go to companies, 80% goes to higher income people. So households, to subsidize solar PV on the roofs, insulate their houses, or subsidize Teslas. And then, of course, you get populism. Very true. And that is why Milieudefensie has been campaigning very hard for a CO2 tax that can be used to invest in poorer households.
Okay, yeah, I understand. But then looking at the EU taxonomy already in place with investors more and more divesting into other asset classes, and of course we have the green bonds and the green loans, etc. Together with the taxonomy that will be in place beyond green activities, stating companies like Shell. Do you not think that an EU taxonomy and the Brussels ripple effect that brings with it is sufficient?
I think you really need a flanking policy. And it seems as if the European Commission has recognized this, because Frans Timmermans has publicly stated his support for mitigating measures for lower income households. I think the taxonomy as it is at this stage is not perfect, but it's an important first step.
Right. Thank you so much.
Can I ask a question? I actually was interested on the content of the court case, because I was wondering what is a point that the court case could stand or fall on.
Yeah.
So
okay, I can summarize it. Yeah, it's I can summarize it. In essence, what we are arguing is what is called the duty of care, a zorgplicht. And the zorgplicht or duty of care holds that any individual or company in their actions should take account of the impact of their actions on third parties. And it's often the basis in the Dutch law is something that is called the kelderluik criteria, the cellar door criteria. And it's based on and I'll just make it very short. It's very interesting. And it illustrates the beauty of our law system, how our law develops. Because in 1960, a couple from Maastricht visited Amsterdam, and you can imagine what they did. So they went to a cafe, had a few drinks. The guy of the couple went to the toilet, and on the way, he tripped over an open door of the cellar, because the owner of the cafe was busy loading drinks into the cellar. The guy fell into the cellar and had of course damages. He hurt himself rather badly, and to cover the cost of his the impact, he went to court, and the court decided that the cafe owner had the responsibility, the duty of care, to ensure that either that the door was closed or that he was warned that the door was standing open. And what we are arguing is that the CO2 emissions produced by Shell is the open cellar door. Shell has the duty of care to ensure that their activities, their actions, does not contribute to a dangerous situation for us as citizens, and by not mitigating their CO2 emissions, they are creating this danger. And Shell is then saying, but everything we are doing, we have permits for. Everything we do, we have permits for. So when we sell petrol at the petrol station in the neighborhood, we have a permit for that. When we develop an oil well, we have a permit for that. But we are saying, even if you have a permit to cut off the tree in your own garden, you have the duty of care to ensure that that tree does not fall onto my hedge. And that is if this will be what will determine the outcome of the court case. If the judge recognizes that our arguments of a duty of care, then Shell will lose. And if the judge says we are interpreting the duty of care too broadly, then we will lose.
Okay,
Donald,
thank you.
Donald, I just checked. There's also a chat, and I think Nikilesh wanted to ask something. I don't know if you're there. Oh, I can just read it out. Yeah. So see.
Yes, yes, I'm here. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
So my question was, within the EU, you earlier mentioned that a border tax could help create a level playing field. But outside the EU, how do you see this materializing? How do, say, a company from Russia is taxed less than, say, a company from Netherlands? So how do you see a level playing field outside the EU?
Yeah. In theory, how a border tax adjustment works is that when a European company, when they export to the non-European market outside of Europe, they get the tax that they had to pay within the European market. They get it back. So the moment that they compete internationally, they compete at a level playing field, because they don't have to include the tax that they paid in Europe if they sell to the US or China or Russia. And any company from outside the European market will still have to pay the same tax that European companies pay. These foreign companies will then still have to pay this tax.
In that case, who pays the CO2 abatement cost that, I mean, the cost that they have to incur to reduce the CO2? Who regulates that in the outside market? Should it be left to the countries, or would there be a central authority that could come in the future?
Yeah, within Europe, the central authority that determines the CO2 price will be the European Union, in all probability. And outside of Europe, that is not important, because outside of Europe, nobody pays the tax. The assumption is that once you have something like a European tax together with a border tax adjustment, that other countries will also start to introduce a CO2 tax.
Okay, perfect. Is there another question?
Yeah, I had another question regarding the case, because the argument you made was, well, Shell says that they have the permit to cut off the tree in their own neighborhood, but then they have the care that the tree doesn't fall on their neighbor's yard. But what I would argue is, first of all, Shell does not do the tree cutting themselves. Like, they only sell the saw, and then somebody else does the cutting. And second of all, I would say, well, the permit doesn't allow you to let the tree fall on somebody else's garden. So they only have a perm to cut the tree. So if that's the only thing what they are doing, then the permit argument would not be the full story then.
Yeah, there are many in the law very comparable situations to this, and that makes it so difficult for the judges, because they could agree or disagree with what you're saying. That is also what Shell is arguing. But whatever they decided will have implications for other similar fields of law, and that makes it so difficult. Even if they agree with you, if they decide to go with you, what will be the implications for other situations? And comparable situations are, for example, the safety of cars. You know, the argument, guns don't kill people, people kill people. Or drugs, who's responsible, the seller of the drug or the user of the drug? We have been, and there are many more. For example, asbestos. We are using the example of asbestos. In the Netherlands, asbestos was legal till far into the 1980s. But still, people that got cancer because of asbestos could go to court and get damages from the asbestos company, even though they said that they sold a legal product. We are arguing, because I'm not trying to get away from a very strong argument that you are mentioning. I'm now going to answer it. We are arguing that the endangerment, the source of the problem is not the CO2, but it's the policy that causes the CO2. So Shell has been saying precisely what you're saying. They are saying it is the CO2 emitted by all of the millions of users of their products. And even if it's not those billions of users of their products, it's the daughter companies, the subsidiaries of Shell in all of the world. They have 1,000 subsidiaries distributed all over the world. If you want to hold somebody responsible other than the consumers, it should be those 1,000 companies. But we are saying the decisions of Shell in the Netherlands, the global company that is based in the Netherlands, that determines if more or less oil is developed. And we are using an example. We are saying in the early 2000s, Shell decided to dismantle its renewable energies unit. And that, of course, had an impact on CO2. So the board of Shell Global can decide either to increase its investments or reduce its investments in fossil fuels, and that has a CO2 implication. So the source of the problem is the policy decisions made by the board and shareholders of Shell. And you can disagree with me, of course. Shell disagrees with us. It will be the judge that will decide who is right or wrong.
Any other question?
If I may jump in just to follow up on that. So if you're saying the source of the problems is Shell's board, their decision on policy, but then that decision of policy cascades down into them applying for the permit, and then we're back at them being granted the permit. So then the circle's gone round. So then that's not really an argument that their policy is the reason that it's happening if the policy is determined by whether or not they get the permit, right? So it's not really an argument. So what's your response to that in court?
What in almost all legal challenges, legal issues, it is the main question is almost always shared responsibility. So this shared responsibility is not unique to our case. I just gave you a few examples of other cases. So it's always the challenge for the court to decide who is the main responsible. And as a global society, we have recognized that this issue of a shared responsibility is a main challenge in order to address complex problems like climate change. Because if you follow your argument, nobody ever can take real action because who's responsible? Or the people that are held responsible have such a small emissions that they have no real impact on climate change. And therefore in 1972, the Organization for Economic Development, the Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, they designed a basic legal principle called the polluter pays. And the polluter pays principle from 1972. And the OECD is the umbrella organization of all industrialized countries. The polluter pays principle says that in any situation of shared responsibility, you look at the actor within that network or that value chain who has the biggest impact in the value chain. So it's similar to the three criteria that I referred to, knows about its contribution, has a major contribution, and can do something substantial to reduce its impact. That is basically the same criteria. So the OECD said the polluter pays principle holds, look at the biggest actor within a shared a network of shared responsibility, which is in this case, of course, Shell.
All right, thank you for the explanation and your talk today.
Okay, Donald, shall we maybe do one last question?
I'm yours.
Okay, who takes it? Anyone?
If no one dares, maybe I can try. I think this might be a nice final question as well. Do you think in the future, in this green planet, these 50 biggest companies, will there still be the Shells, the Exxons, and all the companies who are now building off an oil company to rebuild or to build a new energy company? Or do you think really the big ones won't be the ones with so much interest in oil and carbon emissions, but can just create a beautiful green company from the start?
That is a very difficult question to answer. I think it's maybe comparable to, if I use two examples, one is the company Nokia that we know because of its smartphones. You know, you probably all know that Nokia started off as a tire company. It produced tires for the wheels of cars, and then it noticed that it couldn't compete anymore. Other companies were just better, and they changed themselves within a few years' time from a tire company to a smartphone company. So it's possible for a large multinational company to change its business model radically. Another example is, of course, Kodak, which was the camera company, and they saw that the world was changing, that cameras became digital, but not only that cameras become digital, but it changed into our smartphones. And they did not believe that that the market will change so enormously, and they decided to continue making their old cameras, and they still exist, but it's sort of they produce interesting small stuff for hobbyists. So they really just disappeared, and that will happen. The same thing will happen with fossil fuel companies. You see a number of fossil fuel companies already changing track fundamentally. So the Danish oil company Ørsted changed from being an oil company. They were just a normal oil company like all oil companies, and they are now moving to 100% renewable energy. Another example of a bigger company, because Ørsted is a national oil company from a small country, is British Petroleum, which is on the same level as Total and Shell and Exxon. They announced last year that they will be reducing in absolute terms their oil and gas production by 40% in 2030. And shifting their investments to renewable energy. So that is a sort of you have Ørsted on the one hand saying we're going to change to a fully renewable company. You have BP that is almost reducing their oil production by half as a sort of a middle option. And then you have companies like Shell and Exxon that invest most of their money, in my view, in PR, in public relations and advertising, selling a green image instead of changing their business model. And it is the market will decide where the future lies. I would say it's objectively true that if Shell continues with its current business model, we will be, as a society, we will be confronted by dangerous climate change within 10 to 15 years. And so it's that will at least change Shell if our court case did not change them.
Thank you.
Okay, so I can, yeah. Oh, I guess we're gonna wrap it up. Donald, I first want to thank you so much. Really, there's something going wrong with our speakers, but okay. I really enjoyed it. It was, yeah, I really liked it, and also the discussion. That was great. So thank you very much, and also everybody for coming. That was, yeah, great.